I want to talk about Atomic Heart a little more. It's a game I find really interesting for a lot of reasons. So if you're new with this channel over here, what I do is essentially after I make the before you buy video on Game Ranks, that's the big critical breakdown review-ish of a game. When I have something I want to dive into a little bit more, or I find something interesting, I come over here and talk about some of the best aspects of a game. So Atomic Heart specifically is one where my critical game brain is clashing with my just have fun, just try something new type brain, because there's a lot of things in this game that you should go check out before you buy. Some problems with the game I pointed out, some big fundamental issues I had with this game, but there's still a lot to it that I think is worth discussing. In that video, I boil it down to a charming mess. If you're looking for something new, but you're willing to put up with it, what kind of feels like some AA, not quite AAA studio jank and weirdness, you might have a good time. And now I think a lot of people kind of push back with me on that, where they're like, I don't want to pay $60 US, $70 US for a game that is a mess, but interesting. And that is totally valid. That's why I said in the video to kind of check it out at some point if you're the curious type of gamer. Now, I personally have just always been chasing that new thing. Even before I did this for a job, I was always putting myself into debt, just buying the next game, onto the next thing. Well, what's next? What's new? Like, I always just within the culture, I guess, and I'm always looking for something a bit different. And I think that's why I mostly appreciated Atomic Heart more than other at least maybe YouTube commenters. Like, I've seen a lot of people really not like the game. I've seen some people in comments too just not really be into it, but there were so many things I could point out about the game that technically are not good, or things that I don't like, or even hurt the fun. But just the way the game wears its influences on its sleeve, the way it's a bit unnerving and strange and hard to describe at certain points, in a world that's really interesting, saved it for me. So yes, I don't think maybe like if you want the most pitch perfect, absolutely awesome first-person shooter adventure, maybe it's not going to be one you run out and buy day one for that, or for a multitude of reasons with this game. But that's where I do think sometimes things like Game Pass are good, because you can just hop in, play it for a couple of hours, and check it out. And I will say the game is pretty front-loaded with coolness. Some of its main issues don't actually show it or rear its head until later on, but the way the game kicks off is absolutely fascinating. It goes for that BioShock seeing Rapture for the first time, or like coming into Columbia and BioShock Infinite, those big wow factor moments. This game has it, but with an obnoxiously voiced protagonist that I'm sure you've heard a lot about. But there's still so much to it that's really interesting, like what it takes, like these ideals of kind of bringing old school, old war style Soviet propaganda to life in this new alternate history sci-fi thing. I think that's just an interesting thing. I really enjoyed Man in the High Castle. The Wolfenstein games, the Machine Games Wolfenstein games are great. And this kind of is really influenced by that. I'd say this game is more Wolfenstein, New Colossus, New Order, and also Fallout, really, more than BioShock. BioShock is a little subtler. It tries to be a little smarter. Some of the themes are a little bit more complex, where Atomic Heart obviously deals with some complex themes like communism and artificial intelligence and like a roboticized society, but ultimately it's not afraid to just go balls to the wall and go freaking crazy. And that's what I liked about it. It throws you in this world that is all over the place visually. It looks kind of weird. There's a bunch of wild robots trying to kill you, and it's a mishmash of a bunch of different game designs, some successful, some not, but I just couldn't help but find myself continuing to play because I wanted to see what would come at me next. That's really it. Even if the story wasn't ultra compelling, a lot of it relies to the artificial intelligence just telling you voiceover as you're playing. There's some good cutscenes here and there, but a lot of predictable stuff, and it doesn't really touch too deep on some of those more complex themes. Those are more hidden. You got to look for those. Still, the game, the world, the things thrown at you were interesting enough for me to keep playing from beginning to end. There are some grating parts. There are some grindy parts, some parts that were just not enjoyable, but ultimately, I liked seeing what the next thing they would be thrown at me. Like, as much as I wanted more enemy variations, the bosses were always exciting. I was just excited to see what new robot they could show me, because they all kind of have this weird unsettling nature to them. The robots are kind of twisted. Some of them look like toys. Some of them look like mannequins. Some of them look like old war, like Cold War war machines. And a lot of them are designed for things other than like human murder. But there's just something I can't quite put my finger on how unsettling they are. And I'm not just talking about the mannequin guys. Those are designed to be deeply unsettling with their staring eyes, the weird mustache, but they get old after a while because you get sick of fighting them for so long. But there's just something about all the monsters that just have this weird, creepy edge to it that I can't put my finger on. But I really, really appreciate that. And I like the clash of a lot of those monsters out in the open worlds, where the open worlds are kind of weird. Like there's like, you know, laser fences, but then there's just like old broken buildings and just very normal areas, like wooded areas with shacks and houses, and then big laboratories and buildings with brutalist architecture and over-the-top hammer and sickle statues everywhere. Like the imagery is very contrasted, and I like that. And seeing some of these strange robots just kind of like patrolling these streets make it that much more unnerving. Like it's definitely just got like a threatening presence to it all, and I think that's what they were going for, and I think they nailed that. But it was really the interiors that I like going into to see what new horrors would come about, whether it was all of a sudden now there are like organic monsters or a different type of robot or something that you can't always see. The game changes a lot. Like from area to area, it's all completely different. Like sleek, fancy laboratories, weird, grimy, old Soviet stuff. And I like the way it would change minute to minute. I actually, in the Before You Buy, I mentioned Half-Life, and it's still kind of hard for me to describe how, because the game is nowhere near as good as the original Half-Life. Like, just, let's get that. Let's just be clear. I don't want anyone to like put like words in my mouth or anything. Although now with artificial intelligence, people can just put words in my mouth. This is what's happening. But there's something about it, just like this trek through interiors and figuring out how to get your way through them, that just felt like a little bit like lonely and strange and weird, kind of like Half-Life. It's, again, another thing with this game that's hard to put my finger on. And I think that's a good theme. I want to point that out. There's a lot of things in this game where it's hard to put your finger on it, hard to describe exactly why it works or why it's interesting or why it kind of creeps you out. That with, I think, a really good sense of like tone and atmosphere and music that just really, really works. Mick Gordon was the composer for a lot of this, and there's a lot of great stuff going on here, like some really cool, like tense sci-fi synth stuff, like when you like engage with enemies in the world, like the music ramps up. That stuff is very tense, unnerving, sci-fi cool, but then every once in a while a boss battle will happen and they let Mick Gordon just like be his most Mick Gordon, like a boss shows up and it literally bam, 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 like it just immediately you're like, okay, there he is, he's doing his thing. But it's all the other little things here and there that really, really worked for me, that helped kind of build out this world. So like the vending machines, or not really the vending machines, because like there's no currency, there's no money because of the concept of this world, but the fact that when you open up these like vending, trading, crafting machines, there's a really good little catchy jingle. Like it's stuck in my head. It's been stuck in my head since I played the game. It's so good, and the game has lots of those little things littered around throughout the world. Then the game also just like uses good licensing for a lot of like old opera music and orchestral music, like just recognizable stuff you may have heard before, from like the Nutcracker to like all kinds of stuff that really just helps set a good and strange vibe. Like when you walk into an environment and there's like haunting opera music playing, or like a part in the early game when someone's spouting exposition at you to the tune of dun 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 dun, dun in the background, it just works. So you have that music, you have like weird, organic, gross things, you have this dystopian world, you have some robots that are horrific with how their faces are gonna open and they look like skulls. Then you have like the hot ballerina robots. Like there's also these massive screen-filling robots. There's a lot of that. And when that's all going down and the music's hitting, it's a very interesting time. When you boil down some moment-to-moment stuff, and even some of like the weaker elements of the melee combat, or just the kind of pacing of it is a little tedious. The game, for being 20 hours, is commendable, but also kind of overstays its welcome a little bit. I think a lot of it felt like it was kind of drawn out a bit. There's still just something there with this one. I think the fact that I've talked 10 minutes about a game that, like, you know, I have a lot more to say about what doesn't work, I think is kind of commendable. And I think ultimately just why I think this game is really going to find an audience that really digs it. And something I did want to point out as like a follow-up, shout out to some commenters and people who pointed out who live in Europe or Russia, who pointed out that part of the reason the voice acting and is like so, and the writing is so cringeworthy is that it actually just works better in a different language. So switching to a different language like Russian, like the original voice acting, could help. And ultimately, yeah, it's something that I'm glad I played through. It got me thinking about some things, just how it portrayed that society, especially at the start. It left me kind of wanting more because like you get a glimpse of like this like weird utopian society where they seemingly figured everything out, but you know that like shit's gonna go down, of course. But then you're immediately thrust into kind of like a separate world where it's just kind of you and the robots. So you don't really get to see like a downfall of civilization or like the folly of man and their flawed ideas or anything like that. I don't know if it was the game like a budget thing, like they were like, no, just stick to robots. But I would have liked to have seen more than that, because I think that aspect of like this like alternate future society, like I said at the start, is always cool. This one is interesting. It actually kind of dives into some of the stuff. It uses a lot of the imagery, some of the problematic stuff and ideas of those times, but in a way that just kind of looks at it. It doesn't glorify it or anything. Like, because of the Soviet Union, many people died. But to me, it was handled like anything else you see in Wolfenstein. But again, I didn't really talk about the Fallout influences, but for me, a lot of it is really the like pastiche of an older time period, the kind of like happy-go-lucky, everything's great nature of the 1950s, that bright, happy sunshine to everything, the fancy jingles, the smiling people in the marketing. Fallout had that, of course, like from the old world before the nukes, and this very much has that as well. And I always think that's a pretty good thing for games to kind of explore, because there was so much not great during those times. So where the real world had that, and then like you look back and it just had this like plasticky, shiny, happy facade over it, in this game world, it's really like that shiny, happy facade, the jingles, the fancy, nice stuff, the shiny cars and beautiful technology, underlying just seemingly a failed society that relied too much on robots, and all the robots are haunted and fucked up and weird. But even still, with that, it all came down to people. Not spoiling anything, but yeah. So again, I think if you go into it with expectations, and if you go in at some point, I know $70 is getting harder and harder to justify for nothing less than perfect, and I get that, but if you go into it at some point not expecting the next BioShock or something like that, just go in kind of seeing a weird experiment, you know? I chase that thrill. I always want to see that new sound you're looking for, you know, in a game. And for me, Atomic Heart was like a pretty much almost there. And for a game studio's first outing, I think this is really impressive. It's also a game that we've been talking about for a long time and looking at. And at the start, it always just kind of looked like a glorified, flashy tech demo. And you were always wondering kind of like, could this really be a game? And surprisingly, it is. It's not really like what I expected it to be, but still, it's interesting, and I thought it was worth talking about. Despite all the flaws and all that, I like to come over here and just talk about some of the good things in games, the things that I found interesting, and there was a lot with Atomic Heart. So check out the Before You Buy if you haven't already for like the deep dive, the harsher criticism. Thank you if you already did watch that, and thanks for coming over here and listening to me just yap about a video game. I do it all the time. New games, old games, sometimes movies, so yeah. Also, be sure to check it out. I'll link it in the description down below, and it'll pop up after this video. My monthly Q&A video, I do one every month where I take your questions and talk about stuff I wouldn't talk about in other videos, like ideas for a Dead Space 2 remake, AI art generators, but in video games. A lot of good stuff in that video. YouTube kind of like borked it when it went out, so I'll link that. But thank you guys for being here, listening to me ramble. If you get what I'm trying to do here, clicking the like button helps me out. Thank you. But as always, thanks for watching. Subscribe because video games, pizza's on me.